Eat it, the towering American guard grunted, his voice rough with fatigue as he pointed a gloved finger at the metal tray trembling in the woman's hands. Elsa stared down at the steaming pile of bright yellow sludge, her stomach churning not from the gnawing hunger that had plagued her for weeks, but from a sudden, violent wave of nausea and profound humiliation. Please make sure you watch until the very end of this video, because what happens next will completely overturn everything you think you know about the brutality of war and the strange, hidden language of food. It was late April 1945, and the once mighty structure of the Third Reich was crumbling into dust and ash around them, leaving millions of civilians displaced, starving, and terrified of the conquering armies that were closing in from the west. Elsa, a 22-year-old auxiliary nurse from a small village in Bavaria, had been captured 3 days prior near the Rhine, exhausted beyond words, her gray uniform stained with mud, grease, and the dried blood of soldiers she couldn't save. For years, the relentless propaganda machine in Berlin had hammered a single, terrifying message into her mind. The Americans were gangsters, uncultured barbarians who would humiliate the German people before destroying them. She had expected a bullet to the back of the head, or perhaps a damp, dark cell deep underground. But instead, she found herself in a temporary open-air enclosure, herded together with hundreds of other women under the gray, weeping sky. The hunger was a physical weight, a sharp, twisting cramp that felt like a rusted knife turning in her gut. Yet when the dinner whistle blew, the paralyzing fear of what they would be fed outweighed the starvation. She shuffled forward in the line, the mud sucking at her worn boots, clutching a dented tin plate that she had scavenged, watching the women ahead of her receive their rations with blank, hollow eyes that seemed to stare at nothing. The air smelled of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, acrid exhaust of the American jeeps patrolling the perimeter. A sensory overload for a woman who had spent the last month hiding in basements. When she finally reached the front of the line, the large ladle dipped into a massive, steaming vat and slapped a generous portion of yellow kernels onto her tray with a wet, sloppy sound that made her flinch. Elsa froze, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes widening in absolute disbelief as she recognized the substance immediately, a sight that confirmed every dark rumor she had ever heard about the cruelty of the invaders. It was maize cornbutt, not the kind humans ate. In her village in Bavaria, this hard, yellow grain was grown exclusively for one specific agricultural purpose. It was for the pigs. They see us as animals, so they are feeding us like animals, the other woman replied, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks, staring at the yellow pile with a look of absolute disgust, refusing to even lift her spoon. Elsa felt a hot flush of shame rise up her neck, burning her ears. She looked around and saw the Americans standing nearby, well-fed, chewing gum, smoking cigarettes, looking healthy and strong, while they forced these starving women to eat pig swill. She stood there, paralyzed, the tray heavy in her hands, the steam rising from the corn, carrying a sweet, alien scent that her brain refused to process as food, interpreting it instead as the smell of a barnyard. A shadow fell over her, blocking the weak afternoon light, and she looked up into the face of a young American corporal, a man with grease smeared on his cheek and a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't look angry. He looked impatient, perhaps a little confused by the line stalling, and he gestured emphatically with his chin toward the yellow pile on her plate. "Go on," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "It's good for you. Plenty of calories. You need to eat." Elsa didn't understand the English words, but the tone was a clear command, and she knew that disobeying a guard in a prisoner camp could result in consequences she didn't want to imagine. Her hand shook violently as she lifted the tin spoon, the metal clinking against her teeth, and she forced her mouth open, fighting every instinct that told her to throw the plate into the mud. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the taste of dry, hard, flavorless grain that would crack her teeth and choke her throat, the texture of misery and defeat. She anticipated the texture of animal fodder, gritty and raw, the ultimate symbol of her a final act of punishment from the victors to the vanquished. The spoon entered her mouth, and she bit down, waiting for the misery to hit, waiting for the gag reflex to take over. But instead of grit, there was a burst of sweetness so intense, so unexpected it made her jaw ache. The kernels popped softly between her teeth, releasing a creamy, buttery liquid that tasted like nothing she had ever experienced in her life. A flavor profile that was completely alien to her war-torn palate. It was warm, it was soft, and it was undeniably, shockingly delicious, seasoned with salt and something rich, likely canned margarine or butter that coated her tongue in luxury. Her eyes snapped open, wide with shock, and she looked down at the pig food with total confusion, her brain scrambling to reconcile the taste with the visual. This wasn't fodder. This was a luxury. Canned sweet corn, a staple of the American diet that they had shipped across the ocean in millions of olive-drab tins. To feed their own troops, the sweetness was overpowering, a sharp contrast to the black bread and watery turnip soup she had survived on for the last 2 years of the war. She looked up at the corporal again, and teased time seeing the look of bewildered ecstasy on her face. He didn't bark an order or threaten her. He simply cracked a small, tired smile, reached into his own pocket, pulled out a small spoon, and mimed eating, nodding his head as if to say, "I told you so." In that fleeting second, the wall of propaganda, the fear of the barbarian enemy, and the humiliation of defeat dissolved into the simple, universal pleasure of a hot, sweet meal. She took another bite, then another, shoveling the yellow kernels into her mouth as fast as she could, the tears on her face now born from relief rather than shame. For the first time in months, she wasn't a nurse, or a prisoner, or a German. She was just a human being, warm and full, standing in the mud. This is a true story inspired by historical records of German posts encountering American corn for the first time. Do you agree that food can bridge the gap between enemies? Tell us in the comments and follow for more stories.